So we're going to be focusing on the philosophical issues that pertain to abortion. And there are a lot of different issues that we could address, but there are two that are of paramount concern. And the first one is what we might refer to as the issue that pertains to the fetal status and personhood of the fetus. Now, a lot of times you might hear this kind of issue brought up in the context when people will ask questions or say things like, when does life begin? And this, I think, is just a very colloquial way of putting exactly what is at issue here. It's a little bit imprecise for reasons that we'll see in just a few moments, but this is the central, I think, the central issue for a whole lot of people when we talk about the issue of abortion, and that just is the fetus a person, yes or no? Because as we're going to see, if the fetus is a person, that entails that it has certain kinds of rights. And these rights place huge restrictions on what we can and cannot do to that individual. The second issue that we're going to address, and this is a really important issue when it comes to the abortion debate, which is an issue about how we weigh and balance the competing rights and interests of the fetus and the mother. Even if we assume that the fetus is a person and we endow it with these certain kinds of rights, well, the mother is also a person and she has certain kinds of rights. So exactly how do we weigh and balance those competing rights against one another? Sometimes you'll hear this issue expressed in common conversation where women will say things like, well, it's my body and I have a right to do with my body as I see fit. And when they're talking about this, what they're basically indicating here is that, as a person, you have certain rights over what you can and you can't do with your body. And when you hear someone say something like this, what they're indicating is they assume or they think that their bodily rights win out over whatever rights that the fetus might have. We're going to look next, I think in like a week or two, we're going to focus on this particular issue, issue number 2. But what we're going to do in the remainder of this class and the next couple classes is focus on the first issue, the personhood of the fetus. And as I was saying, for many, many people, this is the central moral issue. For the upcoming classes, I'm going to have you read a couple of essays, and one of those essays is by this person right here, John Noonan. And in the essay by John Noonan, he says this. He says, the most fundamental question involved in the long history of thought on abortion is this: how do you determine the humanity of a being? And what Noonan is referring to here when he says the humanity of a being is basically saying the most fundamental issue when it comes to abortion is the fetus a person, yes or no? And it's a good place we can stop and you can ask yourself, well, why is this particular issue so important? Why is the issue of whether or not the fetus is a person? Why would someone like Noonan regard this as so important? And in fact, why have many others who've looked at this issue regarded this as so important? And I'm going to, in this video lecture, try to answer that question. In fact, we're going to spend this class and the next one talking about why personhood is in fact so important. Now, before we get going, we do need to draw some important distinctions. And we've already seen these distinctions presented when we talked about Kant's moral philosophy. And when we're discussing the status of the fetus, we need to distinguish between, on the one hand, human, and on the other hand, person. And the difference between these is just this, is that a human is a member of a certain biological species. Someone is a human just in case they have our genetics or our DNA. But someone is a person, that's a different kind of category. When we place someone in the category of person, that's not something that's necessarily determined by their biology. Personhood is a moral category. So human is a biological category, whereas person is a moral category. And members who belong to the category of persons, we sometimes call them, we say they're full members of the moral community, that they have certain rights and privileges, moral rights and privileges. And I want to just demonstrate this distinction a little bit because, this came up when we talked about Kant, that these terms are a lot of times used interchangeably. And in fact, we just saw John Noonan using the terms interchangeably. He said, how do you determine the humanity of a person? What he's really asking or saying there is, how do you determine whether or not someone is a person at all? That, I think, is a more precise way of asking his question. But to demonstrate the difference between these, I want you to just consider, for an instance, and I know I always get a little funny looks when I say this to people, but consider, for instance, an alien visitor came down. We encountered a visitor from outer space. They traveled across the galaxy, they got here, they communicated with us, maybe they look a lot like us, they have feelings, they have families, this sort of thing. And you look at them and you talk to them, and I would assume, typically think that we should treat them with a certain level of dignity and respect. That we couldn't just capture them and use them as pets or use them as food, that they would have basically the same rights that we do. When I say rights, I mean moral rights. Like, you couldn't just slaughter them en masse. You'd have to treat them with a certain level of dignity and respect. But notice this, they wouldn't be humans. They wouldn't have our biology at all. But nonetheless, we would have to regard them in this kind of way. Or to use an example that's a little less bizarre, the Neanderthal were actually a race of people who were separate from Homo sapiens. The Neanderthal, they weren't in our lineage of evolution. They were a completely separate species. They had a different biology, a different DNA, and for various reasons they died out along the way. But suppose Neanderthal had evolved right alongside of Homo sapiens, and they lived among us, they looked like us, they talked like us. Well, presumably we'd have to treat them with the same kind of rights and privileges that we treat other Homo sapiens. We'd have to afford them a full status in the moral community. But notice that they wouldn't be human, not in the technical sense of the word. They wouldn't have our biology. They wouldn't have our DNA. But we would nonetheless have to treat them with certain kinds of rights and privileges. And we saw for Kant, what puts you in this moral category is the fact that you possess free will. That was what was so important for Kant. And if you had that, then you were a full member of the moral community, even if you weren't human. What we're going to do in the next couple classes is look at some different theories about what puts you in this category of persons. Today we're just going to be talking, and in the next class just talking about the importance of personhood for the debate about abortion. As I said, the big difference here between a human and a person is just this. A human is a member of a biological species. Person is a full member of the moral community. And you don't necessarily have to have our biology in order to be a full member of the moral community. And in fact, it's arguable that you could have our biology and not be a full member of the moral community. Someone who is in a permanent comatose state, for instance, they might be a human because they have our biology, but it's arguable that they're no longer a person because they lack certain kinds of capabilities and capacities, and for that reason, they don't have full rights and privileges any longer. So what I want to do at this point is try to figure out a little bit more about what exactly these rights and privileges are that people have. To this point, I've just been kind of speaking in a very broad fashion, saying, hey, if you're a person, you're a full member of the moral community, and you have a certain set of rights and privileges. And one way to kind of get at and understand what the rights and privileges are that people have is to contrast clear cases of people from clear cases of non-persons. We might, for instance, ask, well, what are some of the things we can do to animals that we can't necessarily do to people? What are some things that are morally permissible ways of treating animals that it wouldn't be morally permissible to do to a person? And it would be a really good exercise if you just stopped for a moment and thought about this. What can you do to an animal that you can't do to a person? Well, I mean, one thing you can clearly see in this picture is we put leashes on animals and we walk them around. Now, I know some people have harnesses for their kids, but I feel like there's something different about that. I think we would typically regard it as degrading if you walked a person around on a leash. I know some people are into some kind of kinky sex stuff, and that's, enjoyable to them, and that's cool. Not judging anyone here. That's perfectly cool if that's what you're into. But by and large, in most instances, walking a person around on a leash would be kind of degrading. But maybe some clearer examples of some differences here of things we can do to people, to animals that we can't do to people, is that we put animals to sleep. If an animal gets old or sick, we'll put it to sleep. If the truth is, if an animal needs a kind of surgery and we can't afford it, we'll a lot of times just put the animal to sleep. If we find an animal and nobody wants it, we'll take it to the pound. No one comes to claim it. After a certain amount of time, the pound will put it to sleep. But we don't do that to people, even people who are unwanted. We wouldn't just round children up off the streets and say, well, no one's come to claim this child for 30 days, so we'll just put them to sleep. We wouldn't do that. We eat animals. We eat cows and pigs and chickens and goats and lambs and all kinds of things. But we don't do that to people, or I think a lot of us would consider that immoral to do. We breed animals in captivity. We'll take one dog and we'll put it in a pen with another dog, and we'll try to force them to mate. I know sometimes parents try to set their kids up with other kids, but it's not quite the same thing. We don't just lock two 18-year-olds or 20-year-olds in a cage until they do the deed. We don't do that. That would be considered immoral and wrong. We also own animals, and we don't own people. Owning people would be slavery, and that is generally considered immoral these days across not just the United States, but in pretty much everywhere around the world. I know there's some places that still have slavery, but most places now regard that as immoral. But we don't regard it as immoral to own animals. And so you see here what we've just done is I've pointed out some ways that we can treat animals that seems perfectly permissible and perfectly natural, that it wouldn't be appropriate to treat people in just those ways. And we might ask, what exactly does this differential treatment reveal? That we can do some things to animals that we can't do to people. And I think the answer to that is fairly obvious, is that people have certain kinds of moral rights that the so-called lower animals don't possess. People have certain rights of reproduction, certain rights of freedom, certain rights against bodily harm. And these rights are possessed by all, and this is what's key, only people. Only people possess these certain kinds of rights. Now, we could go into quite a bit of time to try to spell out exactly what these rights are, but not all of these are going to be necessary for the present discussion. But one right that is going to be really important for our discussion is a very, very important right that people have that lower animals don't, and this is what we call a right to life. This is a very unique, very special right, and all people have it, and only people have it. Dogs don't possess a right to life. Cats don't possess a right to life. Chimpanzees don't possess a right to life. Only people have this right. And this is one of the most important rights that people have. If you're a person, you have it. And if you have it, then you're a person. Like I said, all and only people have a right to life. And this is some language that I think is maybe familiar to some of you and maybe not familiar to others. Some of you have probably heard talk of right to life before. Some of you may not have. And what I want to do is, because this right is so important and because this right is so critical in the present discussion, I want to spend a little bit of time trying to flesh out exactly what a right to life is. Because it's not exactly obvious, or not immediately obvious anyway, what a right to life is. Now, one of the main ways that people try to define a right to life, and one of the definitions that you'll quite often hear when people say what a right to life is they'll say, well, a right to life is a right not to be killed. And we have to stop and ask ourselves, does that seem like a right that people possess? Do people possess a right not to be killed? Well, in some sense you might think, yeah, I think I possess that right. But if you get down to it, and you get really technical, the truth is nobody possesses such a right. Why do I say that? Well, because if people possessed a right not to be killed, then what that would mean is that it would be immoral to kill anyone for any reason whatsoever. And I know some people who are pacifists feel this way, that it's always wrong to kill another person. But I think in general, most people recognize that there are some times when it would be permissible to kill another person. For instance, a case of self-defense. If someone is attacking you, and the only way that you can stop that attacker is to kill them, most people would regard that killing as morally permissible, that you haven't violated any of that person's rights by killing them. You haven't done anything wrong. And so this would be an instance where we could see that there can be an exception made where it would be permissible to kill another person. And so if we're trying to come up with the definition of what a right to life is, I think just saying a right not to be killed is going to be too broad because no one seems to have such a right. A better way of putting this is to say it's a right not to be unjustly killed. This is a right that people have, is I have a right not to be unjustly killed. And I recognize that there could be instances where it would be permissible to kill me. For instance, if I'm threatening another person's life, if I'm attacking them to, say, steal their Air Jordans, then that person has a right to defend themselves. Or again, maybe I'm not attacking them, maybe I'm attacking their children. Suppose I were to break into someone's house and I was trying to kill someone's children. Would they have a right to kill me in order to stop my threat? I think most of us would say yes, that you would have a right to kill someone to stop them from threatening your children's lives. So this would be a case, again, of a justified killing. So I think this is a much better definition when we're talking about what a right to life is. A right to life is a right not to be unjustly killed. But even this has some problems. And the problems with this is just this, is that if you stop and think about it, even animals require some justification to kill. Even animals, you can't just kill an animal for no reason whatsoever. I wouldn't think, at least not in most cases. We kill animals, and the justifications we have for killing them are going to be maybe food, or maybe they're posing a threat to our property, or maybe they're posing a threat to our lives. But think about this for a second. Suppose that I were a puppy breeder, and I bred puppies, and as soon as they were born, I would just kill them. And you said, well, why did you kill them? Were they bad? Did they have rabies? And I said, no, this is just my hobby. I breed puppies, and as soon as they're born, I just kill them. I just do it because, you got to have a hobby. Some people collect trinkets. I kill puppies. And I want you to stop. You guys, for the record, I don't harm animals, just so you know. This is just an example. But suppose you heard this. Would you think, oh, yeah, that guy, he's got his hobby. I do my thing. I do yoga, but he kills puppies. That's just fine. Or would you think, and you might even be just, troubled by the very example that I've just given. It wouldn't be permissible. Why is that? Well, it might be permissible to put a dog to sleep if he has cancer. Well, then we have a good reason. It might be permissible to kill a dog if he was attacking your child. It might even be permissible to kill a dog if he were, he was frequently destroying your property, or maybe he had bitten someone. But it wouldn't be permissible to kill them for just pure fun and enjoyment, I don't think. Even people I know who are hunters, who hunt deer for enjoyment, they use that meat. They think that it's not permissible. Everyone I know who hunts, they think that it's wrong just to kill an animal and not use the meat. That the only way that you can justifiably kill an animal is you have to use and keep what you kill. I think that we would typically regard killing, even of animals, without any kind of justification whatsoever, to be wrong. And so this leads us to a very, very difficult question to some extent to answer, is what constitutes a just reason to kill a person? Because what we've done so far is we said, well, a right to life is a right not to be unjustly killed. Well, what exactly is a just reason? That's a very difficult question to answer. I'm going to try to do my best to answer that, though, by just kind of walking through some various reasons that we might use to justify killing different types of things. Because what we're going to see is that the more complex something is, the more, you might say, evolved it is in a certain kind of way, the greater the level of justification that's required in order to kill it. So I just want you to look at this right here and think about the various types of justifications that we might enlist that would enable us to kill something in each category. So if we're looking at, for instance, the category of plants down here at the bottom, what would be a sufficient justification to kill a plant? And you might even be laughing at this, because the truth is, Whoa, wrong button. The truth is you don't really need much of a justification at all. If I have a tree in my front yard and I don't want the tree anymore, I can just cut it down. All right? If I have grass in my front yard and I want to dump mulch all over it and get rid of it, I can do that. It doesn't really matter. As long as I own it, I have a right to kill it. I don't really need much justification. If I have a garden full of flowers and I decided I don't want to deal with this anymore, I can just run them over with a lawnmower. But something really important happens as we cross from the threshold from plants up to animals. And when we get to this threshold, we're going to need greater level of justification to kill an animal that more than we do to kill a plant. And I think the most obvious reason for why this is that animals feel pain and plants don't feel pain. And because they feel pain, we need more justification in order to kill them. As we saw when we talked about utilitarianism, pain is bad. And you can't just inflict pain, even if it's on an animal, for no reason whatsoever. And so we ask, well, what is a sufficient justification to kill an animal? And it's going to be, I think, a number of different things we can enlist here. One reason might be for food. We kill animals for food, and that seems morally justifiable. Another reason that we might kill an animal is because, and this is going to sound horrible, but people do it, is that we can no longer afford it. Like I said earlier, if you can no longer afford an animal, you take it to the pound, and if no one comes to claim it, it'll get put down. And that seems something you might think is really sad, but at the same time, we wouldn't typically regard it, I think most people wouldn't, maybe some of you might regard it as murder, but I think most of us would say it's unfortunate, but it has to happen. If an animal is old or sick, we might put it down to put it out of its misery. If an animal poses a minimal safety threat, I say minimal, let's suppose an animal has bitten a few people. Well, then the law requires that we put it down. But let me stop and ask you this. Would these justifications be good enough justifications to warrant killing a person? And I don't think the answer will be yes. We're not allowed to breed people and kill them for food. We do that with cows, right? We grow cows, we raise cows for food, but that wouldn't be a sound justification to kill a person. It also wouldn't be a sound justification to say, well, I can't afford it, so I just drop my baby off, and then 30 days later they killed it. That wouldn't be good. If a person is old or sick, I mean, we can't just take grandma somewhere and say, well, she's 90 at this point, she's kind of old, we're just going to put her down. I don't think that would be morally permissible. If someone is going around biting someone, if grandma's at the nursing home and she's bitten a nurse a few times, we don't put her down. That would be immoral to do that. But when it comes to a dog, we might do that. Or if a child is, in, kindergarten and he keeps biting other kindergartners, we don't, euthanize that child because they're biting people. We might discipline them, but we wouldn't euthanize them. But we would do that for an animal. Now we cross another threshold and we get to the level of persons. And we need to ask, what is a sufficient justification to kill a person? And here, as it turns out, there are going to be very, very few. And in fact, if I'm to be honest, the only one I can think of that's uncontroversial is for defense. Defense of one's own life or defense of somebody else's life. If you kill another person in order to defend life, I think most people would regard that as justifiable. Arguably, there are more. For instance, punishment. Some people think capital punishment is morally justifiable. You kill someone if they've performed a very heinous act. That's something that's debatable. One I don't have listed up here and I should have mentioned is euthanasia. Some people think if, for instance, a person is suffering from a long-term illness, their condition is terminal, then it should be morally permissible to euthanize them. But that, again, is something that's very controversial. The only clear and definitive justification that I have encountered that's been presented to me for killing another person is defense of life. And so this reveals something that's, I think, really, really important for us, is that when we're talking about a right to life, what a right to life it guarantees you is basically a right not to be killed except in cases of defense of life. A right to life guarantees you arguably a right not to be killed in defense of life, maybe punishment, and maybe for euthanasia. But the only clear one that I know of is a right not to be killed except when it comes to cases of defense. So this is really what a right to life gets you. And as you can see, this is a pretty stringent right. This places huge duties on the rest of us. I can't kill you to take your shoes. I can't kill you to steal your company. I can't kill you because you're annoying me. I can't kill you because, I don't know, you annoy everybody else. I can't kill you because you're old or sick or any of these other kinds of reasons. The only clear reason that I can use to kill another person is defense of life, either my own or someone else's. So a right to life is a pretty, as I just said, stringent right. It's a right that is possessed only by people, I should mention. If you're a person, then you possess this right, and if you possess this right, then you're a person. It's possessed by all and only people. Now we turn back to the debate about abortion. And this is what's so important here. Because if the fetus is a person, then it has the exact same rights as any other person. If the fetus is a person, then it has a right to life. And basically what that means is just that if the fetus is a person, then the only real justification we can use to kill the fetus is for purposes of defense. I don't think punishment would really apply in this case, nor do I think euthanasia might apply. So if we thought, for instance, that we were sparing the fetus from a life of misery, that might apply. Of course, that's going to presuppose that euthanizing a person is morally permissible. But what we can say is the only clear justification we could have for killing a fetus would be purposes of defense. And when we're thinking about this, what's going to be really important is next class what we're going to do is we're going to look through some common justifications that people offer for abortion. But what we're going to have to do is think in a certain kind of way and ask, is this justification, is it good enough to justify killing a normal adult? And if it isn't good enough to justify killing a normal adult, then it wouldn't work in the case of the fetus. If the fetus is a person, it has a right to life, and that's the same kind of right that you or I have. It's no fundamentally different. Alternatively, if the fetus isn't a person, then it lacks a right to life. And so the just grounds for killing it are going to be significantly less than the just grounds for killing you or I. They're going to be significantly less. And so hopefully you can see from what we've discussed so far today is that a right to life the reason the issue of personhood is so critical to the debate about abortion is because if the fetus is a person, then it has a right to life. And this right places huge demands on what we can and can't do. On the other hand, if the fetus is not a person, then it doesn't have this right. And so the just reasons for killing it are going to be way, way, way less than if the fetus were in fact a person.